In the merciless grip of Minnesota's deadliest winter storm in decades, a mother doe stands frozen, her two young fawns huddled against her for warmth. The temperature has plunged to 30 below zero, and they haven't eaten in 3 days. The bitter wind cuts through their fur like knives of ice, and the younger fawn has already stumbled twice. They're trapped outside John Morgan's farm fence, and in the next few hours they will certainly die. What happens next will challenge everything. We think we know about the boundaries between humans and wild animals. This isn't just another animal rescue story. This is about a moment of pure trust between species that defies all natural instincts. When a desperate mother deer is forced to choose between her wild nature and her baby's survival, her decision will leave millions in tears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. John Morgan's boots crunched through the frozen snow as he made his early morning rounds, his breath forming thick clouds in the bitter air. At 58, his steps weren't as quick as they used to be, but 30 years of working this land had taught him to read every subtle sign of trouble. Today, everything screamed danger. The Morgan family farm had stood for 3 generations, tucked away in the rolling hills of northern Minnesota. 200 acres of crops in summer, now transformed into an endless white canvas of snow and ice. John had inherited more than just land from his father. He'd inherited a philosophy about living alongside nature rather than fighting against it. "Going to be a bad one," he muttered to his old border collie, Max, who trotted faithfully beside him. The Weather Service was calling it the worst storm system in 50 years, with temperatures set to plummet even further overnight. John had spent the past week preparing extra hay in the barn, heated water troughs for the livestock, emergency generators fueled and ready. But it wasn't his farm animals he was worried about now. The wild creatures that shared his land had no such protection. Already he'd seen signs of wildlife struggling. Rabbit tracks that meandered erratically, showing exhaustion, bird feeders swarmed by desperate cardinals and juncos, and most concerning, deer moving in unusually large groups, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. Inside his farmhouse, John warmed his hands around a cup of coffee, studying the latest weather radar on his tablet. The modern device looked out of place among the worn wooden furniture and family photos that covered the walls. Each frame told a story. His parents in front of the original farmhouse, his late wife Sarah smiling from the porch, their daughter Emma graduating veterinary school in California. Sarah had been gone 5 years now, but her influence remained everywhere. She'd been the one who started their unofficial wildlife sanctuary, turning their east field into a restored prairie that attracted all manner of creatures. "Everything's connected, John," she used to say. "What helps them helps us too." The farm's finances weren't what they used to be. Industrial operations were squeezing out family farms all across the state. But John had resisted selling, even when the offers got tempting. This land was more than just a business to him. It was a legacy of stewardship. His phone buzzed, Emma checking in. "Dad, you've got everything battened down? This storm's looking brutal." "All set, sweetheart. Generators are ready. Animals are secured. Even stocked up on your mother's favorite hot chocolate." He smiled at their shared memory of storm days spent playing board games and drinking cocoa. "Just don't do anything crazy," Emma said, knowing her father too well. "I remember last winter when you spent 3 hours digging out that fox den." "That fox had pups," John defended. "Besides, your mother would have done the same thing." After hanging up, John stood at his kitchen window, watching the storm intensify. The wind was picking up, driving snow sideways across his fields. Visibility was dropping fast. The Weather Service had issued a severe warning. This wasn't just a winter storm anymore. It was potentially life-threatening. Max whined at his feet, sensing his concern. John scratched the dog's ears absently, his mind on the wild creatures out there facing this without shelter. He'd already put out extra feed stations in the protected areas near the barn, but with temperatures this low, food alone wouldn't be enough. His gaze drifted to Sarah's photo. She'd always said that being blessed with safe shelter meant they had a responsibility to help those without it. It's what had driven her to start the wildlife rehabilitation work that Emma eventually followed. Into her veterinary career, the old barn was half empty now that he'd scaled back the farming operation. He'd kept it maintained, though, unable to let go of the family history it represented. Today, its solid walls and deep hay storage might serve a different purpose. Max barked suddenly, drawing John's attention back to the window. Through the swirling snow, he caught movement at the edge of his property. Something large was moving slowly along his fence line. "Time to bundle up, boy," John told his faithful companion. "We need to check this out." As he pulled on his heavy winter gear, John couldn't shake the feeling that this storm was going to test more than just his preparations. It was going to test his heart. The thermometer outside John's kitchen window had dropped another 5 degrees in the past hour, its red line barely visible at 20 below zero. The wind howled through the old oak trees that lined his driveway, their branches creaking under. The weight of accumulated ice. This wasn't just winter anymore. This was survival weather. 30 years on this farm, John muttered to Max as they made their second rounds of the day, and I've never seen it quite like this. The border collie pressed close against his leg, unusual behavior for a dog that typically bounded ahead. On their walks, even Max sensed something different about this storm. John's thoughts drifted to the deer population he'd watched grow over the years. The local herd had learned to trust his property as a safe haven, thanks to Sarah's wildlife programs. During normal winters, they'd bed down in the sheltered grove behind the barn, where the trees broke the wind and the ground stayed relatively clear of snow. But this was no normal winter. The emergency weather radio crackled to life in his pocket. A wind chill warning remains in effect. Exposed skin may suffer frostbite in less than 10 minutes. All residents advised to remain indoors. John clicked it off, knowing what needed to be done. He'd already prepared the barn's east wing, laying fresh hay and ensuring the old building was as draft-free as possible. Sarah had always kept this space ready for wildlife emergencies. Nature might be harsh, she'd say, but that doesn't mean we can't be kind. The local wildlife rehabilitation center had closed last month. Budget cuts. Emma had been furious when she heard, calling from California to rant about short-sighted politicians. Now there was nowhere within 50 miles for injured or distressed wildlife to find help. As John checked the fence line, he noticed how the snow had drifted against it in massive banks. In some places, the drifts nearly reached the top of the 6-foot barrier. The fence had been necessary after losing crops to deer 3 years running, but he'd designed it with gaps at strategic points, allowing wildlife to move through during less severe weather. Those gaps were now mostly sealed by snow and ice. Max suddenly stiffened, his ears perking forward. John followed the dog's gaze toward the western field. Through the swirling snow, he could make out several dark shapes moving slowly along the tree line. The local deer herd, at least a dozen of them, already seeking shelter from the worst of the storm. This was the herd he'd watched all summer, including 2 does who'd raised fawns in the protected grove near his property. He'd seen those fawns grow from wobbly-legged newborns to the more confident young deer they were now, though still dependent on their mothers through their first winter. The radio in his pocket crackled again with an updated warning. Temperatures expected to drop another 15 degrees overnight. The storm was stalling over their region, creating what meteorologists called a polar vortex event. They were looking at potentially record-breaking cold. John thought about the young fawns, their winter coats not yet as thick as the adults. In weather like this, even the natural insulation of deer fur might not be enough. The herd would need to find substantial shelter to survive the night. "Come on, Max," John said, turning toward the barn. "Let's make sure everything's ready, just in case." Inside the barn, John checked his preparations. The east wing was secure with solid walls and a roof that had weathered decades of Minnesota winters. Fresh hay lined the floor, and he'd positioned water containers where they wouldn't freeze, thanks to the small space heater he'd installed years ago for injured wildlife. Sarah would have been proud of his foresight, though she probably would have done even more. The thought made him smile despite his worry. She'd always had a sixth sense about when animals would need help, often preparing spaces days before injured creatures were brought to their door. As he worked, the wind's howl grew louder, and the temperature continued to drop. The storm was intensifying faster than predicted, and night was still hours away. John couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's old wildlife shelter was about to be needed again, perhaps more urgently than ever before. John sat at his kitchen table, warming his hands around a fresh cup of coffee after finishing the barn preparations. Sarah's old wildlife journal lay open before him, its pages filled with her neat handwriting documenting years of animal encounters. His fingers traced her words about their first wildlife rescue, a red-tailed hawk with a broken wing that had collapsed in their cornfield. "Nature has its own way," his father had argued back then. "Not our place to interfere." But Sarah had seen it differently. "We've already interfered by taking their habitat for our farms," she'd said. "Sometimes helping isn't interference. It's rebalancing the scales." The debate had raged in John's mind ever since. 20 years of farming had taught him the harsh realities of nature. He'd seen drought kill crops, disease claim livestock, and winters take their toll on wildlife. Each time the question arose, when to help and when to let nature take its course. Through the window, he watched the storm intensify. The weather radar on his tablet showed the system had stalled completely, creating what meteorologists called a polar vortex. Temperatures would keep dropping for at least another 24 hours. His mind went to the deer herd he'd spotted earlier. In normal winters, they managed fine on their own, but this was different. Max looked up suddenly from his spot by the fire, ears perking forward. The old dog had learned from Sarah to recognize animals in distress, often alerting them to injured wildlife before they spotted it themselves. John had come to trust those instincts. The memory of last winter's fox den rescue surfaced in his mind. Emma had called him crazy for spending hours in the cold, but the image of those pups huddled in the collapsed den had left him no choice. Sarah would have done the same, probably without a second thought, but there was a difference between helping injured animals and interfering with healthy ones. The local wildlife officer, Jim Parker, had lectured him about it just last month. "Good intentions can do more harm than good," he'd warned. "Wild animals need to maintain their natural behaviors and survival instincts." John pulled out his phone and pulled up the article Emma had sent him about wildlife intervention. The research showed that temporary emergency shelter during extreme weather events didn't create long-term dependency. The animals returned to their natural patterns once conditions improved. Still, doubt nagged at him. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Nature's been handling winters since before we came along. Who are we to say we know better?" The wind howled louder, rattling the kitchen windows. The thermometer had dropped another 3 degrees. At this rate, it would hit 40 below by nightfall. Temperatures that could kill even the hardiest wildlife. Sarah's journal caught his eye again, opened to an entry from their worst winter 15 years ago. They'd converted the barn into an emergency shelter during a similar storm, saving 3 dozen animals, including a whole family of deer. The local paper had criticized them for interfering with nature, but Sarah had stood firm. "We're part of Nature too, she told the reporters, and part of being human is having the choice to help. John stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghostly in the frosted glass. The snow had become so thick he could barely see the barn. Somewhere out there, the local wildlife faced a life-or-death struggle against the elements. Max joined him at the window, pressing against his leg, like he used to do with Sarah when she was troubled by a difficult wildlife case. The old dog seemed to share his inner conflict, the instinct to help warring with the wisdom of knowing when to step back. "What would you do, Sarah?" he whispered to the storm. The answer came not in words, but in the memory of her actions, always erring on the side of compassion, yet always respecting the wild nature of the creatures they helped. The emergency weather radio burst to life again, warning of the worst conditions in recorded history. As John listened to the updated forecast, he realized he wasn't just wrestling with a philosophical question anymore. Soon, he would have to make real decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for the animals that shared his land. Sarah had always said that having the power to help came with the responsibility to choose wisely when to use it. As the storm raged outside, John knew he would soon be tested on that principle in ways he'd never imagined. The first sign of trouble came just before dusk. Max's urgent barking pulled John from his weather radio updates, the border collie's stance rigid by the front window. Through the near whiteout conditions, John could barely make out three dark shapes struggling against the wind. His heart sank as he recognized them, the doe with the distinctive white patch on her neck, the one Sarah had nicknamed Star 2 summers ago when she'd first appeared on their land. Behind her, 2 fawns fought to stay on their feet, their small bodies buffeted by wind that could now freeze exposed skin in under 5 minutes. "Dear God," John breathed, grabbing his binoculars. The scene came into sharp focus, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The fawns were showing signs of severe distress, their movements becoming sluggish. The smaller one, likely the female, kept stumbling. Even from this distance, he could see them shivering violently. The mother doe was trying to guide them toward the grove where the herd usually sheltered, but the wind had created massive snowdrifts, blocking their usual paths. John watched as she attempted to break trail for her babies, her own strength visibly fading. Each step seemed to cost her more energy than the last. The smaller fawn collapsed. John's hand was on his coat before he even realized he'd moved, but he forced himself to stop. Years of experience had taught him that rushing out could spook them into running, a fatal mistake in these conditions. He needed to observe, to understand the full situation before acting. Through the binoculars, he watched the mother doe's desperate attempts to rouse her fallen baby. The other fawn huddled against its sibling, their shared body heat their only defense against the killing cold. The mother stood over them, using her body to break the worst of the wind, but John knew it was a losing battle. In these temperatures, they had minutes, not hours. The doe's head came up suddenly, her ears swiveling toward his house. Even through the storm, her instincts remained sharp. She'd survived multiple winters by being cautious, by treating every human presence as a threat. Now that same survival instinct could doom her family. Max whined beside him, reading the tension in John's body. The old dog had helped with enough wildlife rescues to know something was wrong. Outside, the smaller fawn tried to stand again, but couldn't get its legs under it. The temperature on John's digital thermometer dropped another degree. Time was running out. The mother doe pawed at the snow around her fawns, trying to create some shelter, but the wind filled in her efforts almost immediately. Her movements were becoming slower, less coordinated. Even her legendary stamina was reaching its limits. John found himself pressing his hand against the cold window glass, an unconscious gesture of helplessness. Without shelter, the fawns wouldn't survive another hour. Even the mother's chances were dropping with every minute she spent exposed to the killing wind. The emergency radio crackled with a new update. Temperatures continuing to drop. Current conditions potentially lethal to all exposed livestock and wildlife. Emergency shelters open for domestic animals. But there were no emergency shelters for wild deer. No rescue teams that would brave this storm to save them. Just an old farmer watching through his window as nature prepared to take its course. The smaller fawn collapsed again, and this time it didn't try to rise. John's hands shook as he reached for his phone, not from the cold, but from the weight of the decision before him. Wildlife Officer Jim Parker's number was still on speed dial from their conversation last month. His finger hovered over the call button as he watched the fallen fawn through his binoculars. "Leave nature to handle its own," his father's voice echoed in his memory. But there was nothing natural about this storm. The Weather Service had already declared it unprecedented, a once-in-a-century event. Even the hardiest Minnesota wildlife hadn't evolved to handle temperatures this extreme. The phone rang twice before Jim's voicemail picked up. Emergency calls were being redirected to the state center due to storm conditions. John hung up, knowing that even if he got through, help wouldn't arrive in time. The larger fawn had positioned itself between its fallen sibling and the wind, mimicking its mother's protective stance. The gesture, so human in its compassion, made John's chest tight. Star continued her desperate attempts to create shelter, but exhaustion was taking its toll. Her movements were becoming erratic, uncoordinated. "Sarah, what would you do?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer. His late wife had never hesitated when an animal needed help, but she'd also been the first to release them once they recovered, understanding that true compassion meant respecting their wild nature. Max pressed against his leg, whining softly. The border collie had been trained to help with injured wildlife, to approach carefully and calmly. But this situation was different. These weren't injured animals. They were healthy deer facing a lethal storm. Interfering could change their natural behaviors forever. The mother doe suddenly stumbled, catching herself but barely. The sight jolted John. Star was one of the strongest deer he'd seen in 30 years of farming. If she was failing... His eyes moved to the barn, where the east wing stood ready. Sarah had designed it specifically for wildlife emergencies. Warm, secure, with separate areas to minimize human contact. They'd successfully sheltered deer there before, during that terrible ice storm 15 years ago. Every animal had returned to the wild once the weather cleared, but those deer had come seeking shelter on their own. This would mean forcing his help on them, traumatizing them with capture and confinement. Even if he saved their lives, would he be destroying something essential in their wild nature? The smaller fawn shuddered violently, its survival instincts, making one last effort to generate heat. It wouldn't last much longer. The mother doe seemed to sense this, her head lowering to nuzzle her baby with heartbreaking gentleness. John's fingers found Sarah's wedding ring, which he wore on a chain around his neck. The metal was cold against his skin, like the decision crystallizing in his mind. Sometimes compassion meant making the hard choice, not the natural one. His father had been right about leaving nature to handle its own, most of the time. But Sarah had been right too. Humans were part of nature, and they alone had the power to choose when to help and when to step back. The emergency radio's latest update made the decision final. Temperature now at -35 degrees, wind chill approaching -60. These conditions are unsurvivable for exposed wildlife. John grabbed his heavy winter gear and rescue equipment from the mudroom. Whether it was the right choice or not, he couldn't watch them die. Not when he had the power to help. "Coming. Girl," he whispered to the struggling doe, "just hold on a little longer." Before stepping outside, John watched the doe make another desperate attempt to save her family. Star tried to clear a path through the deepening snow, but each step forward was met with snow up to her chest. The wind erased her efforts almost. instantly filling in her tracks with fresh powder. The larger fawn struggled to help its fallen sibling, nosing and pushing, trying to get it back on its feet. The smaller one managed to raise its head, but couldn't find the strength to stand. Their mother's distress was palpable as she circled her children, searching for any kind of shelter. John pulled on his heaviest winter gear, insulated coveralls, double layers of gloves, the Arctic-grade boots Emma had insisted on buying him last Christmas. Even with all this protection, he knew he had maybe 20 minutes before the cold would force him back inside. "Stay, Max," he commanded as he opened the door. The old dog whined but obeyed, understanding his role was to watch and wait. The blast of wind that hit John stole his breath away. The short walk to his truck felt like wading through frozen molasses. Inside the truck's cab, he loaded his rescue gear, heavy blankets, rope, the specialized wildlife carriers Sarah had insisted on keeping. The engine groaned in protest as he turned the key. Even machines struggled in this cold. He needed to get closer, but not so close that he'd panic them into running. Star had known him for 2 years, had eaten from his supplemental feeding stations, but she was still wild. In these conditions, forcing her to run would be a death sentence. John eased the truck forward through the deepening snow, his headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The doe's head snapped up at the sound of the engine. Her body tensed, ready to flee, but the smaller fawn still hadn't moved. He stopped 50 yards away, hoping she would recognize the familiar vehicle. In the headlights, he could see ice forming on her fur. The temperature was still dropping, now well past the point where survival became a matter of minutes, not hours. Star stamped her feet, torn between her fear of the truck and her need to protect her fawns. The larger fawn pressed closer to its sibling, while the smaller one's breathing became increasingly labored. John tried inching the truck closer, but this spooked her. She darted several feet away before returning to her babies, her instincts warring between flight and protection. The attempt to close the distance had only made things worse. He grabbed the grain bucket he kept behind his seat, the same one he used to fill the feeding stations. Maybe the familiar sound of food would help, but when he shook it, the noise was lost in the howling wind. The smaller fawn's breathing was becoming shallower. Its sibling had given up trying to rouse it and now just stood guard, pressing against its mother's legs. Star's own movements were becoming stiffer, the cold slowly winning its battle against her strength. John slammed his hand against the steering wheel in frustration. Everything he tried only seemed to make the situation worse. The doe trusted him enough to graze near his barn in normal weather, but this was different. Her survival instincts were too strong, her fear of humans too deeply ingrained. Through the swirling snow, he watched another rescue attempt fail as Star rejected his careful approach. Time was running out, and he was no closer to saving them than when he started. The smaller fawn's head drooped again, and this time even its mother's frantic nudging brought no response. The storm transformed into something alive and malevolent as darkness began to fall. Wind screamed across the fields with a banshee's wail, driving ice crystals that cut like tiny knives. John's truck, usually so reliable in winter weather, shuddered with each powerful gust. His thermometer had stopped registering at 40 below. The digital display just flashed, as if even technology had given up in the face of such extreme cold. In the headlight's beam, the air itself seemed to crystallize, ice particles dancing like deadly diamonds in the wind. Star was failing. The proud doe, who'd raised 2 sets of twins over the years, now struggled to remain standing. Ice had formed a crust over her fur, cracking with each labored movement. Her head drooped lower and lower, though she still positioned herself to block the worst of the wind from her fawns. The smaller fawn hadn't moved in several minutes. Its sibling kept nudging it, but its responses were becoming weaker. Even from his truck, John could see the violent tremors racking their bodies. Hypothermia was setting in fast. "Come on, old girl," John whispered, his breath frosting inside. The truck cab, despite the heater running full blast, "You know me. Let me help." He tried approaching on foot again, moving as slowly as the bitter cold would allow. Star's head came up, her ears swiveling to track his movement. But this time, instead of showing fear, her eyes held something else. Exhaustion, and perhaps a glimmer of recognition. The wind chose that moment to intensify. A massive gust that nearly knocked John off his feet. The larger fawn staggered, barely catching itself. Star tried to move closer to her babies but stumbled, her legs finally betraying her after hours of fighting the cold. Through the chaos of swirling snow, John noticed something that stopped his heart. The smaller fawn's breathing had become dangerously shallow, its chest barely moving. Even if he got to them now, he might already be too late. His truck's radio crackled with a new emergency alert. Severe weather warning upgraded. Conditions now classified as catastrophic. All outdoor activity potentially lethal, temperature continuing to drop. Star managed to regain her footing, but her movements had lost their natural grace. Now she swayed like a punch-drunk boxer, consciousness fading as her body temperature plummeted. The sight of such a magnificent animal being brought low hit John like a physical blow. Ice was forming on his own face mask, his breath freezing instantly in the brutal cold. He had minutes at most before he'd have to retreat or become a casualty. Himself. The thought of returning to his warm house while this family froze to death was unbearable, but dead rescuers couldn't save anyone. The larger fawn suddenly collapsed beside its sibling, its strength finally giving out. Star tried to reach them but fell again, her legs splaying out beneath her. This time she couldn't rise. The storm's fury peaked, visibility dropping to mere feet. John could barely make out the three dark shapes huddled in the snow, their life. Force ebbing with each passing second. Nature, in all its merciless power, was about to claim 3 more victims, unless someone defied it. Back in his truck's relative warmth, John's fingers trembled as he dialed Emma's number. If anyone would know the right way to handle this, it would be his daughter. The call went straight to voicemail. Cell towers were probably down from the storm. He tried the emergency wildlife hotline next, but got only a recorded message about high call volumes. With growing desperation, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Dr. Anderson's personal number. The retired veterinarian had worked with Sarah for years on wildlife cases. "John?" Anderson's voice crackled through static. "Barely getting signal. Tom, I've got 3 deer dying in front of me, mother and 2 fawns. Temperatures below 40. Need to know, if I intervene, what's the survival chance?" More static then. "Location? 50 yards from my barn. They're trapped by drifts. Smaller fawns nearly gone. Careful approach. Shock can kill them. But in these temperatures..." The call dropped. John slammed his hand against the steering wheel. Through the windshield, he could see Star trying once again to reach her fawns, her movements now alarmingly uncoordinated. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Service spotty. If deer already cold-stressed, moving them risky. But freezing death certain without help. Mum's protocol in barn manual, page 47. Trust your gut, Dad." John reached into his glove compartment where Sarah kept her wildlife rescue manual. The pages were worn from years of use, bookmarked with her notes. He found the section on winter wildlife emergencies, her handwriting in the margins, adding details about deer handling. "In severe cases," she'd written, "the risk of not intervening outweighs trauma of rescue. Approach from downwind. Blankets ready. Work fast." His phone chirped again. Dr. Anderson had managed to send a text. "Below 40, they have minutes, not hours. Standard protocols don't apply. Do what you must. Can advise on aftermath if you get them in." The final confirmation came from Jim Parker, the wildlife officer who'd warned him about interference. "State emergency protocols suspended during extreme weather. Survival takes priority. Document everything for record." John looked up from his phone to see the larger fawn had stopped moving. Only Star remained conscious, and even she was fading fast. The experts had given him the green light, but they couldn't help with the actual rescue. That would fall to him alone. Sarah's manual provided the technical guidance, but the practical challenge remained. How to help animals too weak to help themselves, yet still wild enough to fear human contact. One wrong move could send them running, to certain death in the storm. The wind howled louder, as if mocking his indecision. Professional guidance was useful only if he could act in time, and time was something his freezing charges had almost run out of. The smaller fawn's breathing had become almost imperceptible. Through his binoculars, John could see ice crystals forming around its nostrils, a deadly sign he remembered from Sarah's manual. Core temperature was dropping to fatal levels. The larger fawn now lay completely still beside its sibling, only occasional tremors showing it still lived. Star's condition had deteriorated dramatically in the past few minutes. The proud doe, who'd once bounded effortlessly across his fields now, couldn't stay on her feet for more than a few seconds. Each time she fell, it took her longer to rise. Ice had transformed her coat into frozen armor, restricting her movement and stealing precious body heat. The truck's thermometer had started working again, showing a horrifying reading. 47. Below zero. With wind chill, they were approaching temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in seconds. Even through his layers of Arctic-grade gear, John could feel the cold trying to reach his bones. "Just hold on," he whispered. Though the wind tore the words away. "Please hold on." Star's head came up suddenly, her ears swiveling toward a sound lost in the storm's howl. For a moment, her eyes met John's through the truck's windshield. In that gaze, he saw something that broke his heart. The fierce maternal instinct that had kept her fighting was giving way to despair. She tried one last time to reach her fawns, staggering forward on legs that no longer obeyed her properly. She made it halfway before collapsing, her strength finally exhausted. This time, she didn't try to rise. The sight galvanized John into action. He grabbed the rescue blankets and stepped out into the killing cold. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving ice crystals into any exposed skin. Even breathing hurt as the super-chilled air seared his lungs. He'd helped Sarah rescue injured deer before, but those had been controlled situations with proper equipment and backup. This was different, a desperate gamble against time and cold. One wrong move could send the doe running, killing them all through exhaustion. 20 yards from the deer, John's boots broke through a snow crust, plunging him thigh-deep into powder. The effort to pull free left him gasping in the thin, frozen air. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. The cold was affecting him faster than he'd expected. Star watched his approach, but made no attempt to flee. Whether from exhaustion or some deeper understanding, she remained by her fawns. Ice had frozen her eyelashes together, giving her gaze a tragic, crystalline beauty. The smaller fawn's breathing was now all but invisible. The larger one had stopped, shivering, a dangerous sign that its body was giving up the fight against the cold. Even if John reached them now, there was no guarantee they'd survive the move to the barn. His own hands had gone numb despite the heavy gloves. The rescue blankets seemed to crack in his grip, the extreme cold making even fabric brittle. He had minutes at most before the weather forced him to retreat. The radio in his pocket crackled one final time before freezing completely. Conditions continued to worsen. All emergency services suspended. Remain indoors. But retreat meant death for the deer, a certainty as cold and hard as the ice coating their bodies. John took another step forward, fighting against wind that tried to knock him down. He was their only hope now, and time had run out for hesitation. John's mind raced as he assessed the situation with rapidly numbing clarity. The barn was 50 yards away, might as well be 50 miles in these conditions. Moving 3 hypothermic deer that distance would require more than just strength. It would need precision timing and perfect execution. Sarah's manual had been clear. Hypothermic animals could die from the stress of rescue alone. He'd need to move all 3 deer simultaneously. Separating them would only add panic to their already critical condition. But how could one person safely transport a full-grown doe and 2 fawns? His eyes fell on the large utility sled he used for hauling feed, still attached to his truck. Sarah had modified it years ago for wildlife transport, adding high sides and tie-down points. If he could get them onto it, the plan formed with desperate speed. The fawns were his priority, too weak now to resist, but also the most likely to survive if he could warm them quickly. The doe was the challenge. Even exhausted, she could still bolt if he moved too quickly. He had 3 rescue blankets, a coil of soft rope, and the small bag of grain from his truck. The sled would need padding, something to insulate against the cold metal. The hay in his truck bed might work if it wasn't already frozen solid. "Okay, girl," he whispered, pulling out Sarah's old rescue kit. "Remember how we used to do this?" The kit contained something he'd forgotten about. A small bottle of lavender oil. Sarah had sworn it helped calm frightened animals. His cold, numbed fingers fumbled with the cap as he dabbed some on his gloves. Each step of the plan carried risk. Getting the fawns onto the sled might spook Star into a final, fatal burst of panic, but leaving them exposed while dealing with their mother first would guarantee their death. He couldn't feel his face anymore, and his movements were becoming clumsy, signs that his own exposure was reaching dangerous levels. The rescue would have to be completed in one attempt. There wouldn't be time for a second try. Through frost-clouded vision, he checked his preparations one last time. Sled positioned downwind, hay spread thick across its bottom. Rescue blankets ready, rope organized in easy-to-grab loops. The small space heater in his barn already working to warm the recovery area. Star's eyes tracked his movements, but the usual alertness was fading. Her survival instinct seemed to be warring with exhaustion and a mother's desperation. Maybe, just maybe, that combination would work in his favor. He thought of all the times he'd watched this doe over the years, grazing in his fields, teaching her fawns to forage, leading them through his property with quiet confidence. Now, everything depended on whether enough of that familiarity remained in her freezing brain to override her fear of humans. The wind howled louder, driving the temperature even lower. John's time for planning had run out. Every minute spent preparing was a minute closer to losing them all to the cold. He took one final look at his setup, hearing Sarah's voice in his memory. "Remember, John, when you're dealing with wildlife, you only get one chance. Make it count." Word of John's rescue attempt had somehow spread despite the storm. His neighbor Bill Peterson's voice crackled over the CB radio he kept for emergencies. "John, you're going to get yourself killed out there. No deer is worth this risk." Other voices joined in, the old radio network coming alive with concern and debate. Martha from the general store reminded everyone about the mountain lion incident last winter. "Sometimes nature has to take its course. We can't save everything." But Susan Wheeler, who'd worked with Sarah at the Wildlife Center, defended him. "If anyone can save those deer, it's John Morgan. Sarah taught him everything she knew about wildlife rescue. Besides, this isn't natural selection. This is an extreme weather event." The CB chatter continued as John worked. Some worried he'd die trying to play hero. Others remembered how Sarah's wildlife work had helped the community, teaching them to coexist with the animals that shared their land. His phone buzzed. Text messages were still getting through sporadically. The first was from Sheriff Anderson. "Got reports you're attempting wildlife rescue. Department can't assist due to conditions. Be careful, John. Don't need human casualties tonight." The local wildlife officer's message was more direct. "Morgan, this breaks every protocol we have, but Sarah would be proud. Document everything. could help establish emergency procedures for future events. Even Emma had somehow heard, sending a brief text. "Dad, I know you have to try. Mom would do the same, but please be careful. Use the thermal blankets in the emergency kit first." The debate spread to the community emergency text chain, usually reserved for storm warnings and road closures. Some argued that attempting to save wild animals set a dangerous precedent. Others pointed out that extraordinary times called for extraordinary measures. Reverend Mills weighed in. "Compassion isn't bound by species. John Morgan's doing what his conscience demands. Our prayers are with him." The controversy reached the town's Facebook group, where old arguments about wildlife intervention flared up. Some posted about previous rescue attempts, both successes and failures. Others shared memories of Sarah's wildlife work, how she'd balanced helping animals with respecting their wild nature. But none of this social media debate reached John as he worked in the deadly cold. His focus had narrowed to one simple truth: 3 living creatures needed help that only he could provide. His radio clicked one final time. Bill Peterson again. "John, we've called emergency services. They can't get through the storm. You're on your own out there, but we're watching. Just don't make us explain to Emma why you didn't come back." The comment struck home. John knew every minute he spent in this cold risked his own life. But as he looked at the dying deer family, he remembered something Sarah used to say: "Sometimes being human means making the hard choice, not the safe one." The moment that changed everything came without warning. The smaller fawn, which had been motionless for several minutes, suddenly convulsed. The violent spasm seemed to jolt its mother out of her exhaustion-induced stupor. Star lunged toward her baby, stumbling and falling in the deep snow. But it was what happened next that made John's blood run cold. The larger fawn, trying to reach its sibling, broke through a hidden patch of ice. The crack echoed across the frozen landscape as the young deer plunged chest-deep into the freezing water beneath. Its terrified bleat cut through the storm's howl. Star's reaction was immediate and devastating. Using her last reserves of strength, she threw herself toward her trapped baby, but her weakened legs couldn't support the effort. She collapsed hard, her body shuddering with exhaustion and cold. The larger fawn thrashed desperately, each movement, splashing freezing water onto its already hypothermic body. The frigid pond water would kill it in minutes. Its sibling lay motionless nearby, while their mother could no longer rise to help either of them. The decision point had arrived with brutal clarity. Every wildlife rescue protocol, every careful plan about gradual approach and stress prevention became instantly irrelevant. It was now a matter of seconds, not minutes. John's radio crackled one final time with Bill Peterson's voice. "Dear God, John, we can see it from here. That water, you have to..." The transmission cut off, but it didn't matter. John was already moving. The careful rescue plan he'd created was worthless now. This had become a desperate race against time, with 3 lives hanging by a thread. The smaller fawn's convulsion had been the sign Sarah's manual had warned about, the final system failure before death. The trapped fawn would last mere moments in the freezing water, and Star, having spent the last of her strength trying to help her babies, lay dying in the snow. Nature's brutal efficiency was about to claim all 3, unless John acted immediately. Whatever the consequences, whatever the risk, the time for caution had passed. He reached for his rescue gear, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether any of them survived this night. John moved without conscious thought, decades of farming instincts taking over. He grabbed the rescue blankets and rope, no longer caring about careful approach or proper wildlife handling procedures. The larger fawn's thrashing had grown weaker, its struggles in the icy water becoming desperate and uncoordinated. The bitter wind stripped away his breath as he plunged through snowdrifts, each step a battle against nature itself. His own survival training screamed at him to turn back. These conditions could kill him in minutes, but ahead of him, 3 lives were slipping away even faster. Star's eyes tracked his approach, but she no longer had the strength to rise. Ice had formed a crystal shell over her fur, crackling with each labored breath. The smaller fawn lay motionless beside her, its only movement the shallow rise and fall of its chest. 20 feet from the trapped fawn, John's boots broke through. The same hidden ice patch. Freezing water soaked through his pants, the cold so intense it felt like burning. He caught himself before falling completely through, but now understood the deadly trap that had snared the young deer. "Hang on," he gasped, though the wind tore. The words away. The larger fawn's eyes rolled in terror as he approached, but it was too exhausted to flee. Its struggles had created a widening hole in the ice, each movement bringing it closer to complete submersion. John reached the edge of the broken ice on his hands and knees, spreading his weight to avoid breaking through. The fawn was barely 3 feet away, but those 3 feet might as well have been miles of treacherous ice. One wrong move would plunge them both into the freezing pond. His fingers had lost all feeling despite his heavy gloves. As he fumbled with the rope, trying to fashion a rescue loop, his mind flashed to Sarah's voice during their last wildlife rescue together. "Sometimes you have to trust them to trust you." The fawn's struggles grew weaker, its young body giving into the cold. Star watched from where she lay, her eyes holding a depth of emotion John had never seen in a wild animal. Desperation, fear, and something that looked remarkably like hope. He had one chance to get this right. The cold was affecting his coordination, making his movements clumsy. The rope slipped through his numb fingers twice before he managed to create the loop Sarah had taught him for deer rescue. The fawn's head began to sink. Without further hesitation, John slid forward on the ice. The frozen surface creaked ominously. Beneath him, each inch forward risked plunging him into the same deadly trap that held the fawn. But he no longer had a choice. The distance between rescuer and victim had become a space where life and death balanced on a knife's edge. In that moment, all the debates about wildlife intervention, all the careful protocols and procedures meant nothing. There was only the next breath, the next movement, and the desperate hope that it would be enough. The moment John's hand touched the struggling fawn's neck, something extraordinary happened. Instead of fighting his grip, the young deer went still, as if recognizing this was its only chance for survival. Its eyes wide with terror moments. Before, fixed on John with an almost human awareness of the situation. "Easy now," John whispered, his voice hoarse from the cold. "I've got you." The words were meaningless to the deer, but the tone seemed to reach something primitive and understanding. In its wild nature, with trembling hands, he managed to loop the rope around its chest, behind the front legs, just as Sarah had taught him. Star watched the rescue attempt, her own breathing labored, but her gaze never leaving her trapped baby. When John began to pull the fawn from the water, she made no move to interfere. Whether from exhaustion or some deeper understanding, she seemed to comprehend that this human represented her children's only hope. The fawn's wet fur had already begun to freeze as John dragged it onto solid ice. Every second counted now. Wet fur in these temperatures meant certain death without immediate intervention. He wrapped the first rescue blanket around the shivering creature, his numb fingers struggling with the material. Then came the moment that would stay with him forever. As he moved toward the smaller fawn, Star managed to lift her head. Their eyes met, and in that gaze was something that transcended the natural barrier between human and wild animal. The doe's dark eyes held trust, not the trust of a tame animal, but the desperate faith of a mother surrendering her children's fate to the only hope they had. John worked quickly with the second blanket, wrapping the nearly unconscious smaller fawn. Its breathing was shallow but steady. There was still a chance if he could get it warm soon enough. Through his own pain and exhaustion, he felt a surge of hope. They might actually survive this, but Star herself was fading fast. Ice had formed, a deadly crust over her fur, and her attempts to move grew weaker by the second. When John approached her with the final blanket, she made no attempt to pull away. Her wild instinct for self-preservation had been overcome by cold, and the deeper instinct of maternal trust. "You knew, didn't you?" John murmured as he worked to cover her. "You remembered all those times we left food, all those days you grazed near the barn." His voice caught. "You remembered Sarah." The doe's only response was to press closer to her fawns, using what little body heat she had left to warm them through. The blankets. The gesture nearly broke John's heart. Even now, dying from cold, her maternal instinct remained stronger than her fear. Time had run out. John could no longer feel his hands or feet, and his vision was starting to blur. Dangerous. Signs of his own hypothermia setting in. The sled was ready, positioned as close as he dared bring it. Now came the hardest part, moving 3 severely hypothermic deer 50 yards through killing cold to reach the barn. But something had changed in those moments of connection. As John prepared for the final stage of the rescue, he realized he was no longer just fighting against nature and time. He was working with Star, their efforts united by a shared determination to save her children. Sometimes he would later reflect, trust isn't built on grand gestures or long relationships. Sometimes it's forged in desperate moments when survival depends on believing in something beyond natural instinct. The 50 yards to the barn might as well have been 50 miles. John's muscles screamed as he pulled the sled carrying the fawns, every step a battle against wind that could freeze exposed skin in seconds. Star stumbled beside him, somehow staying. On her feet, guided by the gentle pressure of his hand on her ice-crusted shoulder, the smaller fawn had stopped shivering, a deadly sign. The larger one, still wet from the pond, was turning into a literal block of ice despite the blanket. Even Star's movements were becoming jerky and uncoordinated, her body shutting down from the cold. 20 yards from the barn, Star collapsed. "No, girl," John gasped through frozen lips. "Not now, we're so close." His own vision was starting to darken around the edges, hypothermia setting in. They would either all make it to the barn, or none of them would. With strength born of desperation, he managed to get the doe back on her feet. Each step was an eternity of effort and will, but somehow they kept moving. The barn's outline emerged from the swirling snow, its lights a beacon of hope in the white darkness. The gate was the final challenge, a simple latch that now seemed as complex as a bank vault through his numbed fingers. 3 tries it took him to lift the simple mechanism, precious seconds ticking away as death by cold crept closer. Then the gate swung open. The warm air from the barn hit them like a physical force. John had cranked the heating system to maximum, creating an island of warmth in the killing cold. But the deer, even in their desperate state, hesitated at the threshold. This was the moment of truth. Wild animals, no matter how desperate, rarely chose willing confinement. Even dying, their instinct was to run free. Everything hinged on what Star would do next. John held his breath, his hand still resting gently on her shoulder. "Trust me," he whispered. "Please." Star's head came up, her nostrils flaring at the scent of hay and warmth. For a heartbeat, she stood frozen between wild instinct and survival. Then with slow deliberation, she stepped into the barn. The fawns followed on the sled, pulled by John's last reserves of strength. His hands shook violently as he secured the gate behind them, nearly dropping the latch in the process. They had made it, but there was no time to celebrate. The deer were still critically cold, and his own condition was deteriorating rapidly. Working through the fog of hypothermia, John activated the heating lamps Sarah had installed years ago. Their warm red glow filled the stall, creating a sanctuary of heat in the frozen night. Star stood over her fawns as John removed the ice-crusted blankets and replaced them with fresh, warm ones from the heated storage box. Her eyes never left him, but the fear was gone, replaced by something deeper, a trust born of desperate circumstances and mutual survival. "You did it, old girl," John managed through chattering teeth. "You got them here." As if understanding, the doe slowly lowered herself beside her fawns, allowing their bodies to press close, sharing what warmth they had left. In that moment, the barrier between wild and tame, between human and animal, seemed to dissolve. They were simply creatures fighting for survival together. The next hours became a blur of desperate activity as John fought to save all 3 deer. The smaller fawn was his greatest concern. Its body temperature had dropped dangerously low during the ordeal. Following Sarah's manual, he worked methodically, despite his own exhaustion, applying warm compresses to the critical areas chest, neck, and abdomen. The larger fawn, though stronger, faced its own challenges. Its fur had frozen solid from the pond water, creating a deadly layer of ice that had to be carefully removed. John's hands trembled as he worked, his own body still fighting off the effects of exposure. But Sarah's voice seemed to guide him through each step. Gentle, steady movements. Let them feel your calm. Star surprised him most of all. Rather than retreating to the far corner of the stall, as wild deer typically would, she stayed close, watching his every move with her fawns. When he approached with warm blankets, she shifted just enough to allow him access, but never more than a few feet from her babies. His phone had started working again in the barn's warmth. Emma's texts came rapid-fire as he updated her on their condition. "Dad, they'll need electrolytes. Mom's recipe is in the blue binder. Check their ears and tail tips for frostbite. Keep the heat gradual. Too fast can shock their systems." The small electric kettle Sarah had kept in the barn for wildlife emergencies proved invaluable, allowing him to prepare the warm sugar salt solution Emma had recommended. The real challenge was getting the deer to drink it. Then Star did something remarkable. When John approached with the bowl of warm liquid, she sniffed it carefully, then took a small sip. Her fawns, watching their mother, followed suit. It was as if she was showing them that this human help could be trusted. "You remember this, don't you?" John murmured, watching them drink. "Sarah used to make this same solution for injured deer." He could almost hear his wife's gentle laugh, see her patient smile as she taught him these skills he'd never thought he'd need. The night deepened, but John couldn't rest. He monitored their breathing, checked their temperature, watched for signs of shock or distress. The smaller fawn began shivering again, a good sign, though the sound was heartbreaking. Its body was fighting back, trying to warm itself. Star remained alert despite her exhaustion, dividing her attention between her babies and John. Several times when he dozed off from exhaustion on the hay bale, he awoke to find her watching him, as if she had taken on the role of guardian for all of them. By dawn, all 3 deer were showing signs of improvement. The smaller fawn had started responding to its mother's gentle nudges. The larger one had managed to stand briefly, though its legs still trembled from the ordeal. Even Star's eyes had regained some of their natural brightness. The barn had become more than just shelter. It was a sanctuary where the boundaries between wild and tame, human and animal, had blurred in the face of shared survival. As morning light filtered through the barn windows, John realized they had all emerged from the ordeal changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. 3 months later, spring sunlight warmed the barn as John opened its doors for the last time. The deer family had stayed longer than expected, their recovery slowed by the brutal winter. But now, with temperatures rising and new grass emerging, it was time. Star stood calmly as he removed their last blankets, her winter coat already starting to shed. The fawns, fully recovered from their brush with death, pranced around the stall with renewed energy. The smaller one, which had come so close to dying, now showed no signs of that desperate night. "Ready, girl?" John asked softly, reaching for the gate. Star's eyes met his, showing none of the wild fear they'd held before the storm. Not tame, never that, but changed by their shared experience. She understood now that not all human contact meant danger. The gate swung open to reveal the greening pasture beyond. The fawns bounded out immediately, their joy at open space impossible to contain. But Star paused at the threshold, turning back to John one last time. In that moment, he saw everything: gratitude, trust, and something like farewell. Then she was gone, leading her children toward the distant tree line. John watched until they disappeared, knowing they'd likely return to graze his fields, but never again as the same wild creatures they'd been before the storm. Emma arrived that afternoon, having flown in from California to help document the rehabilitation for her wildlife research. "Dad, what you did that night, it's changing how we think about emergency wildlife intervention. The state's developing new protocols based on your experience." The local wildlife center had reopened, inspired by the story of Star's rescue. New funding had poured in, along with volunteers eager to help. Sarah's old manuals formed the core of their training program. That evening, as John walked his property line, he spotted fresh deer tracks by the barn. Beside them, smaller prints, new fawns, learning the path their mother had shown them. Star was teaching her next generation that this place, this human, meant safety. The bitter debate about wildlife intervention had shifted in the community. Nature might be harsh, but compassion wasn't weakness. Sometimes helping was part of the natural order too. John touched Sarah's ring around his neck, knowing she would have understood best of all. The night he'd opened his gate hadn't just saved 3 lives. It had opened hearts and minds to a new way of seeing our relationship with the wild world around us. Spring's promise wasn't just about renewal. It was about the bridges that could be built between humans and wildlife, when trust overcame fear and compassion overcame caution. Star's family had survived, but they'd given something precious in return. Proof that sometimes the greatest acts of humanity come from treating all life as worthy of our help.